All right, let's continue our discussion of World War II. So what has been discussed so far is the rise of dictators, Stalin and communism in Russia, Mussolini and fascism in Italy, Hitler and Nazism in Germany, um, Japan and their what we'll just call the totalitarian government within the Japanese regime with Hirohito and Hideki Tojo. We talked about Hitler's aggression in Germany leading up to the short-term cause of World War II, the long-term cause being the Treaty of Versailles. We briefly mentioned the rise of the totalitarian and fascist government within Spain with Franco. We talked about the United States being as isolationist as humanly possible. And we then talked about the Munich conference, the idea of appeasement, the short-term cause of Germany invading Poland. The war's not going well. The United States is neutral, but are we really? We do cash carry. We start a peacetime draft. Cash carry doesn't really work, so we do Lend-Lease. We're an arsenal for democracy. We have the Atlantic Charter. Um, there starts to become problems with Japan. We say that they are naughty because they invaded Manchuria. Japan quits the League of Nations. They're trying to create more living space. They bomb Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the date which will live in infamy. We declare war. You have people that volunteer. We also have people that go in through the draft. We talked about the women's role and how that changed with their service with regards to the military. We talked about minorities essentially in the war and their war effort. Women go into the factories. Rosie the Riveter was seen as the main propaganda image in order to get women to join the war. We talked about the government's role in the war. We pay for the war through taxes and war bonds. We create the War Production Board, which is getting and encouraging industries to build things for the war rather than peacetime needs. We have ration booklets for things like bread and sugar and milk for Americans to use. You're asked to grow victory gardens. And here we are for what we're going to talk about in this segment. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the home front, and then we're going to start looking at some of the battles. We're not focusing on all the battles. You need to make sure that you are reading your AMSCO, because there are things that are in AMSCO that are not being covered in this lecture. So you absolutely need to read that, or of course, if you want to read your textbooks, that would make me super happy, but I'm pretty sure that's not happening. So, World War II ends the Great Depression. I think we have stated that probably at least 10 times. So if you don't know by now and you're not sure what ended the Great Depression, remember Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal helps alleviate some of the problems of the Great Depression, but it's World War II that essentially puts the United States back at almost full employment, or as close to a low level of unemployment as we can. Men are going to work in the military, or they are working in factories, and women are going to work in the factories, helping fill the void where the men have gone off to war. There is a second Great Migration for African Americans during World War II, very similar to the Great Migration that we saw during World War I. It's moving out of the segregationist, of the de jure segregationist South, moving up to the North, where they're being heavily recruited for jobs. And again, we see the same things. There's this racial tension that occurs because whites feel like African Americans are taking their jobs. The North still has de facto segregation, which is segregation by custom, not by law, but segregation is still the same. And we talked about, and we're going to mention again in today's lecture, the concept of the double V and how World War II really sets up the civil rights movement. There's an increased movement west by pretty much everybody. People are moving west for the opportunities. They're moving to what's called the Sun Belt. We see an increased effort there of pretty much all populations. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill, is brought up, and it provides education and training for veterans. This is sort of the government's, I'm sorry for the fact that we really messed up the Patman's Bill and issues that they had with the bonus army. We want to get it right. We realize that these guys are young guys. They're going off to war. So say you're 18, you come back and when your service is over, and we want people to, one, to be able to readjust back into society, and two, we want them to have skill sets, because that time when maybe they could have been off at college, they weren't. They were off at war. And so the GI Bill provides money for your college. It's still around today. Your parents, one of your parents may have gone to college on the GI Bill. If your parents didn't use their GI Bill, I had just found this out. Apparently, you could use the GI Bill. I'm not quite sure how that works, but it's vocational training. It's getting the veterans using the skills that they learned in the military and then adding on to those skills and having them be applicable to a peacetime lifestyle. We'll come back to that. So there begins to be some civil rights protests with regards to African Americans and other minorities, but predominantly African Americans being drafted for World War II, because again, as mentioned in the previous lecture, why should I go fight for this war when you aren't giving me equal rights here at home? And it comes up again, the concept of the double V, the idea that African Americans are going to help America win World War II, and then they're going to use that as a launching pad to win equality here at home. We're once again going to quote unquote prove ourselves to white America, and then we finally expect for you to wake up. We are ready for equal rights. It needs to happen. Even Booker T didn't think it was going to take this long. CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality. It is mainly a northern group, but we will see its impact during the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and their goal is to fight racial segregation in the North. Remember, again, the North has what's called de facto segregation. That is segregation by custom. You just do it. There's not a law to enforce it, but there's really nobody that's going to stand up to change it either. So de facto segregation is the segregation that you're seeing up north. So Japanese Americans, you're reading Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, so you're very familiar at this point with internment camps. And as I've said before, it's one of the reasons why I like the book so much, because we don't do a huge effort here focusing on it. It's one of those things where when I was growing up, I think I always thought that concentration camps and internment camps were the same thing, and they're not. They're very, 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 very different. So Japanese Americans faced harsh discrimination following the bombing on Pearl Harbor, because Americans were so taken aback and so caught off guard by the bombing, whereas the U.S. government and the U.S. military knew things weren't going very well, and they sort of knew that something was afoot. Americans really didn't. It's, again, very comparable to September 11th. September 11th, for the average American, came out of the clear blue sky. It came out of nowhere. We had no idea that that was going on. We knew that people didn't like us, but we had no clue that an attack was almost seen as imminent, or that there had been discussion of an attack. Now the U.S. government and the U.S. military knew something was afoot, once again with September 11th, but that's not the kind of information you necessarily share with the general public, because the general public doesn't do well with news of that kind of nature. So just like following September 11th, we wanted to blame someone. We all of a sudden decided that everyone of Arabic descent, or appeared to be of Arabic descent, was someone to be feared, was someone to be ostracized for our society. That's seen on the West Coast with your Japanese Americans. Whether you're in Hawaii, whether you're in California, whether you're in Washington or Oregon or some of the other inland states, not right on the coast, but there was this fear that this was really a possibility now. And because Americans really struggled with telling the difference between someone that was Japanese or Korean or Chinese, all Asians suffered discrimination. And so it was determined by the U.S. government that what really needed to happen was we needed to for really the protection, it was put on by the protection of Japanese Americans themselves, that all Japanese Americans, this is not immigrants, this is if you are Japanese American, we needed to round up and move you to an area in which you would be safer, an area that was better for your own protection, is how it was put. And the military had advised Roosevelt on that, and it was again put that we can't be sure that there aren't spies. And so it just would be better for all of us that we did this. The executive order is 9066. Executive order 9066 is the one that sets up and formally allows the U.S. government to relocate Japanese Americans to internment camps. The internment camps are all located within the interior of the United States. Those that are in the most remote locations are reserved for those people that are believed to be the biggest threat, people that maybe there is some evidence or maybe very compelling evidence that they are involved in spy activities. And I just was trying to look if I had put the map, and I didn't. The map of where the Japanese internment camps are, they're all in places like Idaho, places like Arizona. What's fascinating is that the camps were not ready when the Japanese citizens were forced to move. And so Japanese citizens had to participate in building their own camps. And the camps all look similar. So you can kind of see here, this is the one in Idaho. It looks like summer camp, sort of. Here you go again, sort of looks like summer camp, but not really. Here are kids playing baseball, but families are all living within the camps. There are barbed wire. You're told it's for your own protection, yet the guns that are guarding the camp aren't facing outward, they're facing inward. And so the guards are allowed to shoot people if they appear to be disorderly. And it's just sort of the indignity of being made to move when you didn't do anything wrong. And the idea that you're an American citizen, yet your rights could be stripped away. And so that comes up with a case of Korematsu versus the U.S. So we're going to watch a video in class, or I may put it on Edpuzzle, with regards to Korematsu versus the U.S. And this is where Fred Korematsu sues and says, you violated my rights. You violated due process. You violated illegal search and seizure. You violated all, basically, large portions of the Bill of Rights. But the Supreme Court rules against Fred Korematsu, and they rule in favor of the U.S., essentially the U.S. military, and say that the internment camps are okay, that in times of war, sometimes you have to put the Constitution on the back burner. We've seen this before. You saw this in World War I with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which curtailed freedom of speech. We saw this with Abraham Lincoln and his actions in the border states during the Civil War. There's always been this thing that during times of war, can you suspend the Bill of Rights? And when the war is on, we all say yes, and then later on we look back at the cases and we're like, yeah, no. And so I believe it's in 1988, the U.S. government apologizes for the internment camps. We say that's not nice, and we do pay reparations. So again, here are pictures. This is a look at one of the things telling people of Japanese descent that they had to leave. These are signs of things showing you the discrimination against Japanese. By the way, if you do not know, Japs is considered a racial slur. Please don't use it. So, plans for war in Europe. So here's what's interesting. When the United States enters the war, we enter the war because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and we're mad at Japan. So one would think that our logical first target would actually be Japan, but it's not. Our first target is, we are convinced by Winston Churchill that we really need to focus on Germany, that Germany is a much bigger threat than Japan. And FDR was convinced by Churchill that if the United States could just hold Japan at bay, if we could just kind of hold them off and not really focus on them, that Hitler was an easier target, that Hitler would be beaten quicker, that we had the Allied troops were really committed to beating Hitler. The Allied troops aren't really concerned about Japan because they haven't done anything to them. Our biggest ally in the Pacific is Australia because of, location and proximity. And so the United States becomes an official member of the Allies, and we agree that we will go and we will help Great Britain fight Germany, that's where we will focus our efforts, and then we will really focus all our efforts to beating Japan in the Pacific. So one of the things that you have to think about is when we talk about World War II, rather than doing it chronologically, and I feel like this gets confusing, but it's the way that it's always done, we talk about the war in the terms of theaters. So we're going to talk about the war in Europe, We'll go through all the battles. We'll end the war in Europe. And then we're going to backtrack and we're going to talk about the war in the Pacific, everything that's going on in the Pacific. So it's referred to as the two theaters of war. Theater as in T-H, E-A-T-E-R, a theater. And we're going to go through everything in Europe, and then we're going to go talk about everything in the Pacific. What you need to keep in mind, and the activity that we're going to work on will really help you do this, that this is all going on at the same time. Everything's happening at the same time. We're just looking at it in different segments and different chunks because it really is easier for understanding. All right, so the battle of the Atlantic, or the battle for the Atlantic. So essentially, what Germany wants to do is they want to prevent the United States from sending goods over to the Allies. And they'd been working on this prior to our even officially joining the war. It's in their best interest that we never make it over there, that we're never able to get over to bring supplies and then later on our troops. While we are using planes in a much bigger capacity in World War II than we did in World War I, we're still sending things on these huge major aircraft carriers. So Germany begins this massive attack on the Atlantic using their U-boats. And in fact, U-boats were spotted off the coast of North Carolina. If you're familiar with Fort Macon, which is in Atlantic Beach, Fort Macon was used during World War II. It really is a Civil War fort, but they brought it back. There are remnants of German U-boats off the coast of North Carolina and all down the southern coast of the United States. That's how close the Germans got. This isn't just in the middle of the Atlantic. This is on our home front. This is approaching us. So there's a 3,000-mile swath of the Atlantic Ocean that was seen as a lifeline for Great Britain. We once again employ the convoy system. That is where you have the one boat in the middle with the supplies, and then the gunboats are all surrounding it, attempting to get the U-boats or to protect that area. We're using radar and sonar again. That's coming in. And in 4 months, Germany actually sinks 87 ships. By September of 1942, so almost a year, a little less than a year that we've been involved in the war, they had sunk 681 ships. The Battle of the Atlantic is really an ongoing battle. It refers to who's going to control the Atlantic Ocean, and it's a constant battle between the United States and the German powers in order to prevent us from getting supplies. So this really isn't one that has necessarily specific dates. It's kind of an ongoing thing. All right, so we're looking at our map again. This is, once again, I'll come back and forth because I'm a visual person and it's easier for me to do so. If you remember, Germany pretty much controls everything. Their friends are Italy and Japan over here. Great Britain's free and the Soviet Union is our friend, and they're pushing this way. Germany has conquered all of here, so now they're beginning to focus on going this way. So it's going to be really Germany and the Soviet Union going at it. All right, so the Battle of Stalingrad. By 1943, Allies had victories on sea and land against the Axis powers. The Germans and the Soviet Union have been fighting it out since 1941 on the Eastern Front. And in November of 41, there's a really bad winter in the Soviet Union, and so the German forces kind of get stuck outside of the Soviet Union, outside of Moscow, outside of Leningrad. That prevents them from getting into those areas because the winter is so bad. But by spring and the weather gets warm again, the Germans relaunch their attack. And really, the Battle of Stalingrad becomes a big thing. It is the turning point of the war in the European theater. Turning point of the war in the European theater. The summer of 1942, Germany plans to take the big city of Stalingrad. They bomb the city. They essentially almost burn it to the ground. Battle goes on for weeks. And in the end, Germany controls 9/10 of the city. They control everything except a small block. And we watched in our Stalin video about how even the children were involved or used as pawns within fighting this particular battle. The problem is the Germans obviously didn't pay attention to the hazards of the Russian winter. They did not read about the Battle of Waterloo with Napoleon because they would know you don't want to get stuck with low supplies within a Russian winter. And there was some effort by the Germans of thinking that if they hadn't secured Stalingrad by such and such a date, that they would just retreat and they would get out and then they would push back in again in the spring. but they decided not to. And what ends up happening is the Russian winter cuts off their supply line, and essentially the Germans end up getting starved out, and sort of the Soviets end up getting starved as well. But because the Germans cannot resupply their lines, they end up starting to lose portions and portions of the city throughout that winter of 1942, and the Germans finally surrender of January 31st, 1943. Essentially, what got them was the German winter and starvation. They had a lack of supplies. They physically couldn't fight anymore because they really didn't have the supplies with which to fight. It's a huge death toll for the Soviet Union there. The Soviet Union loses 1.1 million deaths just in the Battle of Stalingrad alone, and those are the deaths that are accounted for. This does not count the people that Stalin killed himself for not fighting hard enough. This is just the ones that were killed by the German powers. That's more than the American deaths in the entire war. Soviet Union is very, 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 very angry at Germany. They've been angry at them since they betrayed them and took Poland. And from this point on, Germany is now retreating. They are no longer taking land in Europe. They're having to hold the land that they've conquered. And the Soviets are coming, and they're coming with revenge, and they are ready to push into Germany. And even within Germany itself, by 1943, the final solution is being ramped up to massive proportions. But within Hitler's own leadership, people are beginning to question Hitler. They're beginning to question his intelligence. They're beginning to question whether he's the right leader. Even within the SS, there are assassination attempts on Hitler. So things within the ranks of Germany are also starting to get really wonky by 1943, certainly by mid-43-44. The North African Front. So North Africa is sort of a big deal in World War II, and that's really because of Italy and its proximity to Italy. So we said that Italy had invaded Ethiopia. They wanted an easy win, but they're also interested in the other areas of North Africa. So during the Battle of Stalingrad, and this is the thing about World War II, again, so much stuff is happening at the same time. It can get a little confusing, but I think the activity that we're going to do is going to help you out. But during the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin comes to his other allies. He goes to the United States. He goes to Great Britain. He goes to the leader of the Free French Forces, Charles de Gaulle. And he's like, listen, y'all need to do something. I don't care what you do. You need to do something big and major and draw Hitler's attention away from Stalingrad so that we can reclaim the city and kick Hitler out of the Soviet Union. If we can do that, things will be really good. Stalin gets very angry pretty much at the United States because he says that we don't help them quick enough and fast enough, and that'll be another reason for the Cold War. So you want to be keeping in the back of your head all the different reasons for the Cold War. But the United States and Great Britain are like, listen, we can't handle anything big in Europe right now because we don't really have help from anybody. Sorry, France, but we don't. And so the decision was to focus on North Africa. That was believed to be easier to win, mainly because you would be fighting the Axis powers, but you really would be fighting Mussolini and Italy, and they were seen as just not as difficult to beat as the Germans were. And so we come up with what's called the soft underbelly plan. So the soft underbelly plan says this: we are going to take, we being the Allied powers, are going to take North Africa. And then once we take North Africa, we're going to move up through Italy, conquer Italy, and come up through Germany this way. And as we're coming up this way, the Soviet Union will be coming that way. We're going to sort of squeeze Germany. And eventually, as you know, because you know the way the war goes, we come up with a plan to hit them from this way as well. But the soft underbelly plan refers to being hit in the gut. If you've ever fallen off a swing or somebody's punched you in your gut and you lose your breath, it takes the breath out of you, and for a minute you have to recover. That's what it meant. We were going to hit the Axis powers in the gut, going up through Italy, and then we would squeeze out Germany. It works. Operation Torch is the invasion of North Africa. It's led by General Dwight Eisenhower, who will later become president. In 1942, American troops land in Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers in North Africa. The main person that we are after in North Africa is I can never say this guy's name. Erwin Rommel, aka the Desert Fox. He's the leader of the Axis troops, and we beat him finally at the Battle of El Alamein in 1943. So if you've noticed, 1943 is sort of a big year. You have the Battle of Stalingrad ending, we win North Africa, and the reason again that we went into North Africa is because Stalin was asking for us to do anything to distract Hitler, and it does distract him, but not to the degree that Stalin was really hoping. So the Italian campaign. During the battle for North Africa, FDR, Churchill, and other lesser military commanders meet at Casablanca, and it's referred to as the Casablanca Conference. Casablanca is in North Africa. It's in Morocco. And we decide that we are only going to accept unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. They don't get to set any terms. It is only that they absolutely quit and we're taking over. So after we win North Africa, part of the soft underbelly plan says that we're going to focus on going up through Italy, and we do exactly that. We capture the island of Sicily in summer of 1943, and by this point, the Italian people have begun revolting against Mussolini. So Italy's got all sorts of problems. You have Mussolini who's being forced to resign. They get rid of him. So now Italy really doesn't have a functional government. They have the military. Everything's a mess domestically within Italy. The Allies are invading. And so the Italians say, look, we want to quit. Remember that Tripart Act, Hitler? We're done. We can't. Hitler's like, oh, heck no, you don't quit. He refuses to allow the Italians to surrender. He will not allow the Italians out of the Tripart Act because Hitler realizes, or at least his military commanders realize, and I'm sure it's kind of obvious, so Hitler did too, that if Italy's gone, the Allies are coming in, and he can't have that. So Italy is forbidden, not allowed to quit, and in fact, Italy is not free until 1945 when the war actually ends. And so the Allies are tied up with battles within Italy, but we are moving solidly toward Germany. And at this point, Germany's in serious trouble because the Soviets are coming for them this way, the Allies are coming for them up this way, and all that stands between them and possibly getting squeezed like a big old pimple is France, because they control France. But the Allies are planning a major attack to free France and come in from this side to take down Hitler. Hitler's starting to panic. He starts increasing the number of deaths that are occurring within the Holocaust, within the death camps. People are moving out of the ghettos. They're moving straight to death camps because they realize that the end, in a way, is coming, and desperate people do crazy, wicked, desperate things. And we will do the D-Day battle tomorrow. I hope you've enjoyed this. I feel like I've talked very excitedly because it's an exciting thing. And hey, I did it in under 30 minutes, so you should be happy. Until next time.